Get underway. This is the stream 8 of the Wellington proposed district plan. I'm Trevor Robinson, the chair. I'm accompanied by Commissioner Lutz, Commissioner on my left, Commissioner Burge and Dash on my right. I think everybody knows the drill after 7 previous hearings. So I welcome to the council team. I gave you an indication that we'd like to hear from Mr. Anstey first, but Mr. Searle, Ms. Van Haren, Giles, are there any opening comments you want to make before we get underway?
No, I mean, I guess I was prepared for just a brief introduction, if that would be helpful.
Well, that's what I had in mind. If you have a brief introduction of your position before we hear the technical backup to that position, because effectively I didn't want to get into a position where we asked you a planning question, you deferred to Mr. Anstey, and we went round in a slow circle. We'd prefer to hear from Mr. Anstey first, and then on the basis of a clear technical position, wherever he lands, we can ask you questions on that basis.
Yeah, understood. So I guess just in terms of just the introduction, my name is Jamie Searle. I'm a senior planning advisor in the district plan team here at Wellington City Council. I'm the author of the Coastal Environment, Natural Character and Public Access Section 42A report. We're joined by Hannah Van Haren, who is the author of the Natural Features and Landscapes Chapter Section 42A report. Both Ms. Van Haren and I have relied on the expert evidence of Mr. Clive Anstey, and Mr. Anstey is here joining us today. So that was basically the brief in terms of the intro, as opposed to getting into the detail of the topics themselves, given both Hannah and I are scheduled for different days. But I mean, I am prepared to give a bit of an overview of the topic, should you wish to take that now, or I can have that before we get into the questions of myself.
Well, let's see how we get on with Mr. Anstey, and we'll go from there.
Perfect, thank you.
The other opening thing is I've indicated that we're going to take a site visit this afternoon. Our ever efficient hearing administrator has organised superb weather for us. Mr. Searle, are you able to join us at the quarry?
I am, yes.
That would be good. To ride shotgun on, effectively, not so much on what we see, but effectively to chaperone our hosts, since we'll need the whole 9 yards in terms of health and safety driving around a quarry, active quarry.
I'm hoping the quarry will provide that.
The quarry will provide us with transport, but my concern is that you see what we see.
Understood.
And the other thing, Mr. Anstey, is that although we're going to ask you some questions today, well, I was going to say, first of all, that our plan is we're going first to the quarry to look at the CE line, or the different options of the CE line. We're going to stop off at Kilmarston and get an idea of what's there. I think Ms. Van Haren Giles, she's landed, like, that may be a little academic, but I think before we talk to the Kilmarston team, I'm not familiar with that part of NIO myself. Or rather, it's more getting an idea of where exactly that is in that broader landscape, and then we're going to take a trip out to Karori, which I'm very familiar with, having walked that track past the Parkvale side about half a dozen times, but my colleagues are less familiar, particularly Commissioner Lutz. So having looked at the three areas where we have contested spatial evidence, Mr. Anstey, if it were possible, I'd like to leave open the option of talking to you again tomorrow morning. Like it may be that after we've tripped around, we're completely comfortable with what you've told us, we understand it, and having seen it on the ground, that we still understand it. But it may equally be that seeing it prompts more questions. Like, I'm not anticipating a huge number of additional questions, but I'd like to leave that option open, and we'll ask our hearing administrator to give you a signal at the end of the day. You're very welcome to come and observe if you'd like, but we'll let you know whether we have more questions at the end of today.
Okay. Fine.
Thank you very much. Now, we have from you, we have a brief of evidence in chief and a brief of rebuttal evidence. Would you care to introduce them? And yourself.
Okay. Just so I guess so you can pick up any biases in my evidence. My background is as a forester, and I worked as a landscape architect for the Forest Service for probably 20 years. So my way of dealing with landscape is very biased by a production forestry perspective. And that means, for me, I see landscape values as quite intuitive. So what I mean by that is, if it looks good, if people respond positively, there must be something practical and positive about it. So I was very taken with the idea of spatial planning, which is now on hold for the next 50 years, possibly, simply because it starts to look at the landscape as a functioning whole. And so I think there are patterns in the landscape that intuitively are right, and that there are areas that need to be protected that give the landscape a coherence which is both visual and functional. Now, coming to Wellington, I think what's confusing for people, and even I find it confusing, is we've now got so many different landscape provisions that it's a little bit hard to see how one fits with the other. So you've got natural character, special amenity, outstanding features and landscapes, ridges and hilltops, and they all seem to address something different, but in fact they all address the same basic issues. And I think in a spatial plan they would, if you put it all together and call them all one thing, it would start to make sense. So it would all be protected landscape, but nuanced according to where it was. So if it was on a ridge or in the coast. So that's my basic thinking. So in a practical example, just coming back to the Parkvale, I think that's a good example of where I think the protection afforded by ridge lines and hilltops actually would align with an objective of council to protect areas of importance to resilience. So you might have an overlay which took out all the areas that were erosion prone, where you would want to be fairly careful about earthworks and vegetation removal. And so I think a lot of the ridge lines and hilltops overlay areas would be protected for functional reasons if you had that resilience objective. So once again, if you took out all the landscape areas and you join them all up together, you would have a spatial framework that I think would significantly contribute to the resilience of the city. Or put another way, if you ask the question, well, which areas should be protected or treated with a certain sensitivity in order that resilience was developed, you would end up taking out a lot of the landscape areas. So well, the point I'm making is it does have a very practical aspect to it. So people might say, well, it's important amenity, and I'd say yes, but it's also important for resilience. And you could also argue further that those are the areas that probably should be intensively managed for pest control, and that would contribute to carbon sequestration. So you can start to add it all up and say, well, landscape's not just visual, it's a whole lot more. It's part of the resilience of the city, it's part of the carbon sink of the city, it's part of the soil and water quality of the city, and that all comes together. So that's always in my mind when I look at specific things. And the quarry site, which is, well, you've identified the two that are sort of contentious. The quarry site doesn't quite fit that, because it's really about a boundary. And personally, whether it's inside the boundary or outside it, probably makes little difference in terms of resilience. My concern about where the boundary sits is that it has a knock-on effect. So it's like if you say, oh, well, yes, yep, we can move the boundary around. The whole of that face along the western side of the harbour, you could have landowners who have the potential for subdivision saying, well, we'll have to move the boundary out here as well. And now I've run too far ahead. I was going to say, I assume that you've read my evidence, and it's probably more fruitful just for you to ask questions. So I've already probably got on to one of your questions.
Well, you have, but that's a useful segue. And if we're declaring biases, I should disclose that I spent 4 or 5 years sitting on hearing panels on the Queenstown Lakes Plan, where every self-respected submitter would show up with both a lawyer and a landscape architect. And one of the issues that I was going to ask you about was the philosophical issue about how you approach these landscape issues. Is that what is a landscape? Big question, because in Queenstown Lakes there are environment court cases that say landscapes are big, features are small, and part of a landscape may not necessarily be an outstanding landscape, but they're part of a landscape. And so one of the decisions I was a party to, where the Environment Court told us we were wrong, was deciding that the Clutha River and the terraces above it were a landscape and not a feature, because the court reversed that. And so the immediate thing that I thought, based with that background, is that the ONLs that have been identified are actually quite small. Are they landscapes?
Yeah, well, they even changed through the assessment process where, I can't remember the precise detail, but one of the features was amalgamated with one of the outstanding landscapes. So there's clear, it's exactly in line with the question you're asking, where somebody said, well, actually, that's not a discrete feature, it's actually a part of the adjacent landscape. So we'll put them together. And it kind of, I don't think it tells you anything except that the distinction's very fuzzy. And so I think, you would say this is an outstanding landscape because there was a continuity across the particular spatial area that all had a degree of quality But it's a bit like natural character in the coastal environment. So, oh, well, the whole coastal environment's got natural character. And I'd say, yeah, it has got, the whole thing does have natural character. But then when you read the policy, the idea is actually to constrain development in areas with natural character and allow development in areas where there's already development or there aren't the constraints of very high natural character. So then you start picking plums, you know, start picking bits out. And I think outstanding landscape or outstanding features is the same. So you've got a landscape and you say, oh, the whole thing's outstanding, like the whole thing's got high natural character, or there are only parts within it that have got high natural character, which is the case with the Wellington coast. And it's the same with landscapes. So some landscapes say, oh, the whole landscape's outstanding. And then people say, oh, no, it's not actually. But there are features within that landscape that would qualify as outstanding. And I think associated with the question, I think you're implying that it's a messy business. And it is. It is. And I think it's easy to understand why it's contentious. And then you come to this boundaries issue. And the boundaries are always very conceptual. And when you're standing on the ground, you think, well, you know, I'm standing on the boundary, but I can't actually see it. You know, I can look to the left or the right, and it's not terribly different. So the theory or the philosophy is really quite convincing and quite clear, but the practical application is always very tricky. And that's why the landscape, I think it's harder for planners actually. I think planning's really difficult because the planner actually is the manager.
And going back to where you started, there is quite a well-known quote from one of the Queenstown decisions that says, you don't need a landscape architect to tell you that a landscape is outstanding. What you need them for is to tell you where it begins and ends.
Yeah.
That because the theory, what the court was saying was, well, if it's outstanding, it should knock you in the eye.
Yeah.
As a layperson.
Yeah.
But deciding where it ends is the tricky bit.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an environment court decision along those lines too, isn't there?
Yes.
You know, if it looks good, if it looks outstanding, it probably is.
Yeah. And the remarkables are called the remarkables for a reason.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Queenstown is a good example to raise because, I mean, this is where I have really mixed feelings about being a landscape architect. I think I'm more a forester because, I mean, my practice is called landscape and resource management. So I can have a quid both ways, but I think I'm more of a resource manager. And I think when you're managing resources, you should have regard to the landscape. So I would start with the functional side of it and the practical side. So if you're in Queenstown, I'd say, well, the whole of Queenstown's a landscape, and it's the whole of the landscape is important, whatever your interests are in Queenstown. So the sort of a commons, and the interest in that commons is the same across all interests. It doesn't matter whether you're a landowner or a tourism operator or, you know, in the hospo industry. Everybody's got an interest in the landscape, and it's largely the same. And it's exactly what you just said. The question is not, is it important or not? Everybody agrees it's important. The question is, how far can you push before you screw it up? Which is the same with the coastal environment. You know, the whole of the coastal environment's important. Some of it's got very high natural character. How much can you change it before the whole thing is perceived to deteriorate? And I think that's particularly the case of Wellington, where you've actually got a pretty clear separation, not like Queenstown, Wellington's a pretty clear separation between what's natural and what's cultural. And we're always pushing that edge. So, you know, the Parkdale Karori site's a really good example of where you've got, you know, the whole of Karori is pushing, all of the suburban development is pushing the edges up into the hills. And everybody agrees that, you know, amenities important and ridges and hilltops and the backdrop, and it adds to property values. You go on and on. But when it comes down to the practical thing, well, here's somebody that owns land and they want to push that edge. And it's precisely what you say. The question is, well, how far do we push that edge and what are the implications? And it's also a good example in terms of what I said earlier. I mean, you know, the issue in pushing the edge, the issue is not just amenity or visual. For me, the issue is probably more soil and water. You know, so there's in order to build on that site, you're going to have to do quite heavy earthworks. Now the earthwork landscapes are constrained, but earthworks sits in another category. But it's again, it's an example of what I'm saying is that the visual and the practical resource effects dimension sort of overlap. So I don't care whether it's constrained on amenity grounds or constrained on earthworks grounds. There just are constraints. There are limits.
And those limits need to be integrated.
Yeah, yep.
Now, the other general question I wanted to ask you about was about the coastal environment, particularly as it influences what we might call the true urban area. So, for instance, the whole of Kilbirnie,
yep,
is defined as part of the coastal environment.
Yep.
Down there, the coastal environment, I think, stretches back. Mr. Searle, correct me, but almost to Lambton Quay.
Yep.
Where does it stop? And the question for you, like the issue, like we obviously have an issue of scope because we have a limited number of submissions. But I read the BOFA's report about their analysis, and they were basically saying it all gets a bit hard when you're talking about defining a coastal environment as it edges into an urban area, and you're saying, well, yes, in a big southerly or a big northerly, spray is going to be going the length of the airport. But is that real? Is that really part of the coastal environment? The whole length of the airport, going back to your point, where the natural character stops at the seawall, and to my untutored eye, everything else is concrete. And so, what's your philosophical view about the way that BOFA's approached, defining the coastal environment line around the city proper?
Well, it's what's another philosophical dimension of planning. Like planning, planning's not about managing things, because the things are the outcome of process. So in the coastal environment, there's the outcome of it being in the coast, and vegetation is a good example. So you get coastal vegetation. But more important is the process dimension of the coastal environment. So what are the processes occurring that would lead to outcomes of natural processes that would define a character which you would say was coastal. So if you have lots of coastal spray and stuff, you'd say, well, you know, the vegetation will be of a coastal nature. And another way of looking at it might be to say, well, a much better example for me, because of my history, is it's like, well, you know, oh, well, water quality, we will manage the water in the stream and we'll measure the quality of the water. And you have to say, well, actually, you know, that water is influenced by what's going on in the whole of the catchment. So the quality of the water in the river is just the outcome of a whole lot of other processes going on in the whole catchment. So you come to the coastal environment, you say, well, what you see visually in the coastal environment is the outcome of a whole lot of very complex processes, not only in time, but over time. So then you come back to the question and you'd say, well, Kilburney's probably a better example. You'd say, well, actually, you know, you only have to go back a couple of hundred years and it was all coastal swamp, sand dunes. So it was clearly coastal, and the same with the airport. So that character would have extended into the airport. So it was once coastal without a doubt, because the whole character was defined by coastal process, and that's been modified because it's an area where, you know, the fact that it's coastal hasn't been sufficiently constraining so that urban development's gone ahead. Whereas if you go around to Terrafiti, right round coastal Wellington on the more remote exposed area, I mean, the reason that it retains a high natural character is it's such a hopeless place to live. You know, nobody's been able to modify it. It's not the result of anybody's virtue. It's the result of the vigour and the power of coastal process. So all we're saying is, you know, if you come around to Kilburney, it's a more benign climate, and therefore, you know, that's enabled development and things like the airport. But that doesn't mean it's not coastal. It just means that the coastal processes are less constraining.
And that specific example, of course, also had an earthquake throwing it up a few meters, so it was less coastal.
I'd forgotten that, but yeah.
Than it was a couple of hundred years ago.
Yeah.
And to what extent should these both natural and man-made changes, when you've also obviously in the central city, you've got the reclamations, they've still got the plaques down the western side of Lambton Quay where the seashore was.
Yeah.
And it's now half a dozen blocks further west. To what extent should those natural and man-made changes influence what we now describe as the coast?
Well, the difficulty, yeah. I mean, for me personally, and I don't know that this is necessarily professional, but from a practical point of view, I'd say, well, if it was coastal until relatively recently, and you can stand there and you can still smell the coast, or you can stand on a view shaft and see the water, I'd say that it's, you know, it continues to be within the coastal environment. However, in a planning sense, it's pretty academic really, because in that situation, the fact that it's in the coastal environment is not really a constraint, because history says it's not a constraint. Well, then you could say, well, you know, if we get another uplift, you will have missed the constraint. And so that, you know, then the question is, well, how far does planning go and anticipating possible effects that are, you know, natural effects? So my short answer to your question is it's still in the coastal environment, but I think it's fairly academic because the character is no longer coastal, because culture has dominated the environment.
And so where that takes me is I have in my mind's eye the diagram that you referenced that's in the Boffitt's report.
Yep.
Different. And so if I can find it, might be in your report. Put the diagram on it, you just described it. But there were 3 stages.
Yeah. Yep.
The initial, clearly the coast up to the first ridge line with coastal influences. The next, which is well, coastal influences, but of a lower level, and then coastal context is the next one up.
Yep.
How does that distinction relate to what's where the lines have been drawn in the urban area? Where is the area of direct coastal influence interaction? So, like, just to take a concrete example, how far back from Frank Kitts Park do you go before it's you're no longer in the coastal environment of being the area with direct interaction with the coast?
Well, I guess if you're looking at Civic Square, you would say, well, you know, the saltwater wedge is moving inland, so the groundwater is being contaminated by salt water. So one of the ways in which you might answer that question is to say, well, to what extent are coastal waters moving inland into the groundwater? So that's, you know, definitely a coastal influence. Anyway, it's a horrible question.
That's why you're the expert. I'm asking the questions.
No, I don't. Well, I wouldn't pretend to have an answer. I think that's what makes it so difficult, because and that's, you know, Shannon Bray has sort of taken the same line on the quarry, and he's quite right. You know, it is blurry because, you know, Boffa have quite rightly been up front and said, well, actually, it isn't that clear. There is a fuzzy area where, you know, there's some coastal influence, but let's not call it coastal. And I think that, you know, they're just being up front really, and it isn't very helpful. It just makes it difficult, but it is difficult.
Now, that's a long intro. I should ask my colleagues if they have any general questions they want to shoot the breeze with you before we go into the specifics. Mr. Dash.
Yeah, just a couple, and just leading on from your initial comment about some of the reasons for natural character being resilience-based, erosion-prone. Where in the assessments that have been done to identify areas of natural character or coastal character is whether the land is erosion-prone or has particular issues with water in that assessment? Is it? It's not there, is it?
No, as far as
it's your forestry bias coming through.
Yeah.
But in terms of what we're dealing with,
yep,
the fact that a piece of land might be in the ridgeline and hilltop area and so forth and is potentially erosion prone doesn't come into play.
No, it doesn't.
Okay, so what is if you're just looking purely at natural character, you're quite comfortable that the lines are as good as they can be.
Yeah.
But you feel that there should be another set of criteria about whether land should be, subject to erosion as well to be included in there. Is that what I'm getting from you?
Perhaps not in the coastal. My head's just going around the coast. Perhaps not in the coastal environment, because I think that's probably not an issue. Although it would come up in earthworks provisions if somebody wanted to do a development, so it would be picked up in the consent process. But where I do think it would be relevant, and I think it will become relevant, but you're quite right, it's not relevant to landscape at the moment. But I do think it will come up in relation to ridgelines and hilltops, and possibly significant amenity, because there are areas where it drapes over and it gets onto quite steep slopes, and I think a lot of those would be erosion prone, but more of significance to soil and water quality. So you'd be concerned there with any earthworks that might affect soil and water. But not at the moment. You're quite right. I mean, it doesn't come into amenity.
Well, we considered earthworks last year, and Ms. Van Heeren Giles will be able to confirm this, but my understanding is that there weren't necessarily the triggers relating to coastal or natural values when it came to earthworks, particularly in relation to those sites, when it came to assessing earthworks.
In the coast?
In the coast or in ridgelines and hilltops as well.
Okay.
Perhaps we can get that clarification as something I could do, but it's only just raised itself as an issue because of your initial comments about the identification of some of these ridgelines, hilltops, as an example. It very much has a resilience function as well with erosion sediment control, when the whole reason for it is the natural amenity values that a particular piece of land would have, rather than whether or not it is subject to potential erosion issues.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get off track, but as somebody who was never trained as a planner, but became involved in planning in the Forest Service, my first reaction, and it was very reactive, was I thought zoning was bloody rubbish. I thought zoning was really destructive and separatist and unsustainable, because way back then, I'm talking a long time ago, zoning tended to imply an exclusive use. So you broke up the landscape into boxes and said, well, this is your box and this is your box. And then with the Resource Management Act, then it enables you to say, well, this area of land, whilst it may be primarily to serve this particular interest, it also has a whole lot of other values that are of importance to other interests, or whatever happens in this particular area has effects for people in other areas, downstream values and stuff. So it became, with the Resource Management Act, we moved on, well, in my head, I moved on from zoning, and I could start to see that an amenity area, yes, you could say that's important for amenity, but you could also say what's important for soil and water, carbon sequestration, indigenous biodiversity, habitat, that could be important for a whole range of things, which adds weight to the need to protect it. So I mean, ideally, it just gets too hard, but ideally you would look at the landscape of Wellington and you would and the overlay system in the planning document is, I think it's brilliant. You know, it's sort of, to me, it would have been unimaginable to have something like that 50 years ago, where you can switch things on and off, and you can see how, you know, these various layers interact one with the other. So you can see, you know, integrated multiple use becomes graphic. You know, it's not something you talk about. You can say, well, look at this map, digital map in the district plan. That'll tell you how these things interact, and it's hugely helpful. I just get annoyed because it's such a silly on a squidgy screen, but I mean, that's just me being nitpicking. So I think, going back to Mr. Daish's question, I mean, I think we do think multiple values, we do think integration, so we do think about an area being designated for amenity, but we also recognise that it has these other values. And of course, you know, when it comes to a contest, people tend to say, and this is where I get ratty, people tend to say, oh, well, you know, amenity is all about taste and it's personal and, you know, doesn't matter to everybody. And you say, well, it depends, actually. In some places it does.
Okay. The other general question that I have is again in relation to the comments that you gave to the chair about the extent of the coastal environment overlay.
Yep.
The chair referenced Lambton Quay, but he also referenced the Kilburnie area.
Yep.
Now, you from a landscape perspective, you're satisfied that the process that has been undertaken to define the coastal environment as mapped on the overlay is sufficiently robust. I'm thinking again, you know, I've got my overlays on my screen in front of me over the council maps at the moment, but looking at Kilburnie and the extent of the coastal environment, basically covering all the way up to the foothills, including Kilburnie town centre. And from a natural character, natural environment perspective, or a coastal environment perspective, it just seems a little odd that Kilburnie town centre, for example, has an overlay over the top of it. It's quite some distance from the actual coast itself. Doesn't display outwardly any coastal natural character features to me as a layperson in landscape terms. Well, what would you be your comment about whether or not that's just in some areas of the city, the identification of areas as being in the coastal environment is excessive? And I don't necessarily know we've got a whole lot of submissions to deal with that point, but intuitively when looking at it, it does seem very extensive, and particularly when you get much further away from the coast as we now know it.
It's a bit. I mean, I guess the short answer is it's the coastal processes versus coastal features argument. So there's no coastal features left, but the coastal processes, I think.
So what sort of coastal processes would, you're talking Kilburnie town centre, you're talking Bay Road, yep. Kilburnie, what sort of coastal processes are in play there? Are you talking about sort of the relationship of seawater to groundwater, as you mentioned in your example?
No, I couldn't say that. No, I couldn't say that because I wouldn't know.
And I guess where it may or may not bite is where it actually gets triggered in a real development scenario as well.
Yeah.
Because I've looked elsewhere in the country at those which are in the coastal environment, and you just can't think of how would you deal with it differently, because a particular site which might be 500 metres or a kilometre away from the actual physical coast itself, as we now know.
Yeah.
How is this displaying coastal environmental attributes because it's actually so far distance and often the land has been modified in between?
Well, I guess it's almost like archaeological values or tangata whenua values, where you say, well, you won't find anything until you dig it up, but we know they're there, so you've got to tread carefully. And Kilbirnie would be a bit the same. You'd say, well, it has a history of being coastal. And again, it comes to the practical thing. And if somebody wanted to do a development, you'd say, oh, well, actually, this is in the coastal environment. And then the next question would be, like your question, well, what constraints would it be in the coastal environment imposed? And the answer would be none, because the values arising out of it being coastal are negligible or nil. It doesn't mean it's not in the coastal environment, but the constraints because of it being in the coastal environment are nil.
But yeah, and that's exactly the point we were discussing, is
Yeah.
whether a site, Kilbirnie Town Centre, because I've been using that as an example,
Yeah.
whether it displays any coastal environmental values or not,
No, it
because of
doesn't.
where it is. So then the next question is, why should it have a coastal environment overlay over the top of it?
Well, that
Might be more a question of Mr. Searle, but
well, we have had that discussion.
when looking at the maps and the overlays itself, so some of them go a long way in, and we're not talking about any of the coastal hazards, and we've been through those hearings last year where we looked specifically at coastal inundation, tsunami risk, and so forth, which are in a separate bucket.
Yeah.
To this. But I was just interested in your views whether or not there's been sufficient ground truthing, firstly, and then secondly, if a site was a kilometre away from the coast, how would you determine whether or not to apply the coastal provisions or the coastal objectives of policies when looking at a development, since it isn't on the face of it necessarily displaying any coastal values at all, because of its proximity or the lack of proximity to the physical coast?
No, I would agree with that. No, you're right. But the implication then is, we'll define the boundary of the coastal environment, but then we'll take out all of the areas that no longer express any of the original coastal character, and you'd end up with a planning nightmare, really, because
so is that's the issue, is that there could be too much blurring between what's in and what's out.
Yeah, I think
so. Is it your view that perhaps the council in the notification of the proposed plan has determined to take a very risk-averse identification of the coastal environment, because there is potential uncertainty, and so it's better to have it in rather than not because of potential adverse effects?
Well, I think there's got to be. I mean, this applies more on the quarry side, I think, but I do think there has to be. I suppose if I express my idealism, I'd say, well, you'd have no plan at all. You deal with everything on a case-by-case basis. So you'd have all of the legislation, and on a case-by-case basis, you'd say, well, here's a proposal, and you'd run through your questions. So then you could be more site-specific. But as planners, we have to generalise. So we have to say, well, overall it's in or it's out. Personally, I feel quite happy that Kilbirnie's in, and I suppose, I could be having unreasonable faith in Boffa-Miskel because they will have run through all these arguments. So I accept their outcome. And I then think that, you know, as a generalisation, you say, well, the boundary of the coastal environment is here. And you apply it overall, and you can't start having nuance. You can't go along the boundary and take it in and out because there's developed bits and not developed bits, because it just gets too messy. So then we come to the quarry, and you say, oh, well, we'll make an exception for the quarry. So here's the line, here's the general line, but in the case of the quarry, we'll shift the line down, and then you know, it would then follow that all of the people that own land along the Western Hill, you know, and I know because I've been involved in projects where developers are pushing down over the edge with development. And so if you move it at the quarry, they'll say, oh, well, you know, you've moved theirs down. You know, we want it moved to the top of the escarpment all the way along, and that'll open up a whole lot of land. And so the reason that you have an on average line is, and I discussed this with Boyden Evans because of this hearing, you know, Boyden said, well, you would expect that in a consenting process, people may take issue with the boundary because we may have it wrong. But on average, you know, as a generalisation, we think we've got it right. And so what he says is exactly what's happened with the quarry. They're saying, well, yeah, but the line that you've drawn is just, you know, a best guess. But on a case-by-case basis, you may vary it. So then you come down to Kilbirnie and you say, well, on a case-by-case basis, this would probably be excluded. But then you see it gets really tricky because I've been involved in the airport, not for this, but with the extension of the runway. So you have exactly Mr. Dacia's argument. You know, at what point does the runway become part of the coastal environment? And so you say, well, if you push it out, you know, if you extend it, there's no argument it's definitely in the coastal environment. And then the question is, well, how far does it go back? And the argument was that the existing airport is part of the urban area. So the character is urban, it's not coastal, which is Mr. Dacia's contention. And they're right, you know, it is dominantly developed and urban. But as you go towards the coast, you know, so you got that question again, when does it become coastal in character?
Yeah, it wouldn't be my contention. That's probably you here to assist us.
Yeah.
I had a question about, you know, the methodology and whether or not giving it a good view over whether that really sounds right, that this particular property is actually in the coastal environment. That's what I'm trying to understand, is the methodology and the reasoning for the extent of the coastal environment. And you've used the Horokiwi Quarry. That's the most focused area that we have in terms of this hearing.
Yeah.
But in terms of the usability, workability of yet another overlay on sites which may or may not display coastal environmental characteristics, it could be potentially a concern, and yet another layer of things that people need to look at if they wish to develop a property.
Yeah.
I said, you know, and just again looking at that Kilbirnie area, it goes, you know, halfway up Rodrigo Road.
Yeah.
Don't know how well you know Kilbirnie, but it's one of the streets which goes up from Queen's Drive and goes up the hill. So, you know, that's the questions I have about the extent of the coastal environment and where it is in focus for this hearing, obviously, is the quarry.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, to be perfectly honest, I largely accepted buffer assessment. And I did ask questions that you're asking, but I thought, well, they're never ending. You know, they've clearly gone through the same questions and decide as a group. No, I mean, it wasn't one person deciding, there was a team of experts. And they decided where the boundaries were. And I thought, well, you know, if I start picking at it, where will I end? So I more or less accepted it. But I do accept your question's a really good question. I get around it by saying, well, in the case of Kilburnie, it won't be a constraint, even though it's in the coastal environment. It won't be a constraint on development because there's no features of natural character relevant to the coastal environment that will constrain people.
And so then the next question is why have it as in an overlay area? So, you know, I accept what you're saying, and that's probably my general questions that I have of you. I've got some more specific ones, but
well, let's finish this. Any general questions?
My general ones have sort of been answered, but just to follow on from that, so you've accepted Boffa-Miskell's methodology, their assessment. Well, you just sort of said, because I didn't want to tamper with the edges. If I just sort of need to explore that a little bit more. So if what was so compelling with the Boffa-Miskell assessment for you not to delve deeper into some of those boundaries?
Well, going back, probably for the reasons I stated about planning generally. As a matter of principle, planning is about generalities. You know, so planning doesn't address specific sites because you can't do it. You just can't do it. I would prefer that you did. I'd prefer that all the plans got thrown away and you had all the rules and principles and legislation and you dealt case by case. But that would be a nightmare. So you have to have a plan that gives people, you know, I'm not doing suck eggs, you know all this. So then you come to landscape, and I have to accept that when you're dealing with the landscape overall, you're into generalizations. So then I read the Boffa, all the Boffa stuff, and I mean I have to ask myself, well, would I do any better? You know, as far, it's not perfect, but has it gone as far as it can reasonably go? My answer is yes. And then I talked to Boyden, you know, and Boyden says, yes, it has limits. But the limits, you know, where it's fuzzy, the fuzziness will be dealt with in the consent process. And I, you know, I accept that.
If that was done again today, would the methodology be any different?
Well, short answer, no. But then, you know, there may be, no, I don't think so.
So the boundary would be defined using the NZCPS policy.
Yep.
Where the landform didn't clearly define it.
Yeah.
So though that methodology would stay today.
Yep.
So it's still relevant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anstey, just two questions from me. In response to Mr. Dacia's question, you said with the average line comparison, the quarry to the potential development right next door that could happen.
Yeah.
Where do you see the difference between the existing quarry that has already altered the landscape and the wishes of a developer where the landscape is still intact as it is? Where do you see the difference? Because you said, oh yeah, if we allow this with the quarry, then the developer will actually ask the question too and will push. Do you see a difference between something that exists as being modified already and something that is still in its original character, but it's a development site?
Yeah.
Or could be.
Yeah, so what I'd say, like lots of Wellington, topography's been a big constraint on development. You know, so developers have gone until it gets too steep, basically. So when you look along the western hills of the harbour, you can see how development has come off the top, like up in Newlands, and it's tipped over the edge onto the harbour faces. And it's gone only so far because of topography. Then you come along to the quarry, and the quarry hasn't been constrained by topography because they're digging it up. So they've just removed a whole hill or several hills. Now, if you then say, well, if we were to move the boundary down to the bottom edge of the quarry, which is sort of at the top of the steep part of the escarpment, you say, oh, we'll now call that the edge, the coastal boundary edge. Let's call it that. Then people further along the harbour's edge could say, oh, well, if that's the edge of the coastal environment, you can extend that all the way along, and it'll give us this sort of area from the top down to the top of the escarpment. So that area is no longer part of the coastal environment. So therefore it's not constrained.
Yeah, but in terms of that planning issue that you have, in terms of drawing the line, if you draw the line theoretically at the bottom of the quarry, so the quarry is basically, well, large parts out.
Yep.
And you then go back to where the character is still there.
Yep.
No, regardless if it's possibly developable land or not, isn't that a clearer distinction rather than saying they might at some point in time become developable land, therefore we are excluding it now? Yeah, it's what's there, not what's could be there.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. You could do that. So I have suggested that. I said, all right, well, if the hearing panel was inclined to accept the argument of the quarry and accept that the boundary should be further down and the boundary should be on the edge of the worked area of the quarry, then you could take out the worked area and leave don't alter the boundary on the land that hasn't been quarried. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, I'd agree to that. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. One other thing with regards to visibility, I'm a little bit unclear where you are drawing the line there. Mr. Bray has actually said because of the bottom of the quarry that can't be seen, for that reason it shouldn't be included, or that's one reason why it shouldn't be included. You are saying that visibility is a very minor constraint on the one hand, but then certain paragraphs later, you are saying it's a highly visible, for example, the Watts Peninsula, it's a highly visible part of the wider city landscape, so it's very important.
Yeah.
So where does the visibility come in, or how far do you take the visibility as a valid criterion to add or distract?
Yeah, well, that's another lousy question. So if we start the quarry, Shannon Bray says in his evidence, well, because one of the characteristics of the coastal environment, you know, is it's highly visual, and it has high visual value, and lots of people can see it, as you suggest. Shannon says, well, comes to the quarry, it's very hard to see it unless you're way out in a boat out in the harbour. And he's right. So the visual dimension of the value is not very high if you're looking at the coastal environment as a whole. So you're out on the harbour, you're looking at the Western Hills, and the visual effects of the quarry are minimal in that wider context. However, if you live in a house that's up in Horokiwi, or that there's quite a number of houses can see into the quarry. So if you're a neighbour, then the visual effects can be quite significant. And yeah, that's all I need to say about that. Then you come to Watts Peninsula, and then you would say, well, you know, the audience that is visually affected by what happens is huge, you know, because Watts Peninsula sits sort of, it's seen by lots of people, whether you're close up or whether you're in the city. So visually it's very prominent, whereas the quarry isn't.
So you're distinguishing, if I understand you right, between how many people or what part of the population is affected by that visual effect.
Yeah, I think I don't think you can help yourself doing that. You know, you could argue, as some people would, well, it either has visual effects or it doesn't. Doesn't matter about the number of people. And you could say, yeah, well, the trouble is it's a democracy. So, you know, if it's only a minority of people, well, the effects inevitably are going to effectively be less. Yeah.
Follow-up question from me about that. You're saying, well, the quarry, it's the view the neighbours have from higher sites.
Yep.
But the thought, and that's clearly an amenity effect.
Yep.
But is it a coastal amenity effect?
Good question.
And or is it the kind of amenity effect that the SALs, for instance, are addressing, like a terrestrial landscape amenity?
Yeah, I think it would. You're right. You're right. It would be a visual amenity effect would be registered, picked up in the other provisions, other than the coastal environment. And it'd be good when you go up and have a look at it, actually.
Yes, that Commissioner Birch and I have already done that for the purposes of Stream 6. So I've actually got quite a good idea what it looks like from up there already. Can we go on to the specifics now? I think we've dealt with general questions. We're only an hour and 10 minutes later. I was picking up your support for incorporating the values that Offamiskel identified in their 29 report in Schedule 10 for outstanding landscapes and indeed the other schedule for SALs. The question for me, and it's sort of borne out by your general comments, is have you reviewed all of those values and satisfied yourself that you agree with them, or are you taking the fact that BOFs are clearly a reputable operation, you know the people, you know they will have done a good job, and you're comfortable with? Have you reviewed the content, or are you going on their work?
I have read them, but I'm largely accepting their competence. So I didn't seriously set out to question their findings. I read them more to know what they were rather than to be a critic. So, I mean, in summary, I accept it. their assessment findings.
The next question about landscapes I had was saying, will you agree with Van Haren Giles that the schedule shouldn't talk about the wind farms because they're not actually in the ONLs. Do they contribute to the values of the ONLs? Do they influence those values?
It depends what your interests are. Yeah,
Well,
I mean, I was very involved in the macro wind farm, and that's a really good example actually of this visual effects. So if you were offshore looking at the wind farm, you'd say, well, it's an adverse for me. It's an adverse effect, but I accept it. I don't think it's sufficiently adverse to get uptight about. But if you're a neighbour and you have one of these things within 50 metres of your house, that's a whole different story, because it's not just visual, it's visual plus a lot of other things. So going back to your question, I mean, I would say that having turbines, we've got this culture-nature tension. So I'd say having turbines sort of makes it less natural and more cultural. So you'd say, well, the landscape being appropriated by wind energy companies. So yes, and strictly in landscape terms, you'd probably say yes, it's an adverse effect.
Well, the question is that what we're talking about in the schedule is the values of the ONL.
Yep.
And do those wind farms influence those values? Are they relevant to those values?
No.
Talking about whether the outer green belt is or is not an SAL, offers who as you say, you've deferred to their reasoning, decided it wasn't, except for the specific areas, Cow and is at Wrights Hill, Macra Peak. They decided it wasn't. The council, in their infinite wisdom, decided that it should be in the list. What is your professional opinion? Do they qualify as an SAL, or putting it more bluntly, do you disagree with BOF's assessment?
No, I agree with BOF's assessment, because they had a list of values and they very systematically looked at the whole of the outer town belt, and it's a bit like the natural character in the coastal environment. They said, well, you know, the values exist across the whole of the outer green belt. However, they come together, they're particularly concentrated in these two areas, Cow and Wrights Hill. So yeah, I could see how they got to, I could understand how they got to where they got to. So I would therefore accept that the areas that they didn't say were special weren't special. Now the council says, well, no, they are special, because we don't think they're any different. And I would say, well, they are different, but that doesn't mean that the areas that BOFs didn't classify as special doesn't mean that the other areas didn't have that, you know, significant values. They just weren't high enough. Well, and then you stand back another step and you say, well, I mean, the outer green belt's all owned by the council anyway, so why does it matter? Yeah, so that's where I got to.
The talking about Parkvale.
Yep.
You paragraph 74 of your evidence in chief. You say that the property is very visible both within the immediate Parkville Road area as well as surrounding elevated land.
Yeah.
Mr. Compton says that's not right. We'll just wait and
Yeah, I'm not too sure.
oh, well, we'll have a go. Just don't worry. If there's nothing we can do, we'll live with it. He gave us a visualization from the Crawley Mall end of Parkvale, and the land's obscured by the knob that the two existing houses are on. At this point, I declare some personal interest, albeit historical. I used to live on the opposite side of the valley, halfway up Wrights Hill, looked directly across at that site at about 180, 190 metres elevation. So I had a very good view of that site, and but equally, Mr. Compton Mohan's pointed out there are places where you can't see anything.
Yep.
If you're in under it,
Yep.
Unless you go up to the top of Parkvale Road where it winds into, starts to wind into the hills, you can't actually see anything at all.
No.
So you can't. The near views are obscured, but the far views, especially from the higher views, are not.
Yep.
And I suppose I want to put to you, I'll put to him the opposite point. But do you accept his argument that the near views it's not visible from nearby?
No, I think what you say is absolutely right, and it's a big conundrum when you're assessing visual effects. And the way I would respond is to say, yes, well, it's the near view that's most significant. And if you can't see anything in the near view, well, there's no visual effects. And then somebody says, oh, yeah, but if I'm up on Wrights Hill, I can see it. And you say, yeah, that's true. There'll be a lot of places across the valley, up the hill, that you will see it. But you would then see any development in the context of the whole of that edge. It's not like your eye would just focus on the site and say, oh, there's a new set of apartments gone up there. Yes, you would see them, but visually, the change would tend to be absorbed in the wider landscape. So what I'm saying is the visual effects would potentially be major for somebody living next door, but for somebody living on the opposite side of Karori, the visual effects would be minor. simply because the impact would be absorbed within such a big picture.
And the point you make at the paragraph 76, any development of Parkvale property would tend to be on the easier, lower slopes. What were you referring to? What is low in that context?
Well, Anna and I discussed that. They actually have a conceptual development proposal, and when you're on the site, it's quite clear where highs and where lowers. So it's like a basin, and most of the proposed development tends to be towards the bottom of the basement, whereas there's one particular block of houses on the most western side, and immediately, so if looking at those two houses that are already there that you mentioned, if you're across the other side looking at those two houses, the development that would concern me would be immediately beyond those two houses, and I suspect, but you'd have to actually do an exercise. I suspect that from the viewpoint you talked about, you would look at those two existing houses and you would see this proposed new block immediately beyond those two houses. So they'd be the ones, and they're on the steepest ground, and they'd be the two. That'd be the block that would bother me. The rest, I think, would be absorbed into the more immediate landscape and would have lesser earthworks effects.
Mr. Dash, do you have any specific questions?
Yeah, I've just got a number have been answered already, but in relation to Parkvale, I had the benefit of being on the previous hearing stream where the actual zoning of that particular piece of land, which the submitters are wishing to look at for development, was before us at the time. There was some discussion about the influence of, I think it's 73 and 75 Parkvale, which actually is owned rural, and this wraps around these two particular properties there. Yep. My understanding from the evidence which was presented that those two properties, I think it's 73 and 75 Parkvale.
I think it's 173 and
173.
Yep.
Whatever they are, they actually block out the lower and the medium and many of the longer distance views. Now you seem to think that building on the higher points beyond those that you can see from the other side of Karori would actually jut above, and Mr. Compton said, well, the way to do it is to actually define a line based upon a contour line.
Yeah.
Yes, he said 260.
260.
Yeah, 260.
So if that 260 was agreed, you would feel that there wouldn't be the same level of visual intrusion, and I'm not too sure what that would be.
I'm not sure what that would be, actually, because personally I hadn't thought about the prospect of views from the other side of Karori, because the higher you go, you're looking over.
Yeah.
I mean, if you've been there, you know exactly what I mean. And I don't know how high you'd have to get to be looking over the two existing houses into that basin. But I think some of the proposed buildings, if they were 2-story, you might just see, whether that matters. Personally, I suspect it might not, because when you look across, I mean, I like Karori, and I think the one of the things I like is the way it blends into the hills on the edge. It's not a straight line. There's people have pushed into the hills, and I think it's a natural kind of boundary between urban and rural. So another little push and another building is not going to make, I don't think, a very big impact. But you could begin to explore that question when you visit the site by going up onto the hill, Wrights Hill, and looking back and saying, well, this is what we're seeing now. Would another building make a significant difference? And I suspect it wouldn't. But if you had lots of them pushing right up, because the owner of that block owns a whole lot more that runs back up, and you think, oh well, this is probably the first step in a push, but you know, that's not what we're addressing, so it's not an issue.
I think the theory was that 260 was the point at which you would start to see over the top of the knob that 173 and 175 were on.
Yeah.
And because he was addressing it not on where you might put houses, but where you would put an amended ridgeline and hilltop boundary.
Yeah.
And that was his rationale. And I think Commissioner Dash is asking you, do you have can you contribute to that discussion in the sort of, what do you think is if we agreed that there was going to be a demarcation that in effect below this is okay, above this are varying degrees of not okay, which is not to say it can't happen, because there are no prohibited activities in this plan, not on these sort of issues. But if we're going to draw a line, is that the right place to draw it?
I suppose I'd be conservative and say, well, I think I say in my evidence, I'd prefer that it's stayed where it is. But I don't think the proposal's unreasonable to shift it to that contour line, provided that when you're doing So again, the question for me is, and this is always the tough one for planners, is, well, how rigorous is the consent process going to be? Because by moving the boundary, are we saying, well, you can do what you like inside the boundary, or will the developer be subject to a quite rigorous consent process, which answers some of these other questions? So yes, you can do that development subject to the earthworks being within acceptable limits and the visual effects. And you might define what they would be. I mean, personally, I think you might be hard pushed to be worried about the buildings poking up from when looking from the other side of Karori.
What about from the track going up to the sky?
Oh, that the effects are going to be really significant. Regardless, that whole development is going to be messy for people using the tracks for at least 10 years. You know, but I mean, people get over it. Because when you're walking past there, I mean, I guess you're faced with the prospect of getting up the hill. And in other words, yeah, this is a bit of an eyesore, but this is not, you know, this is just the beginning of the track. Once we get past this and up onto the outer Greenbelt properly, you know, we'll be over it and the houses will recede into the backdrop. But along that entrance piece, yes, yeah, there will be significant effects.
And from the track, properly from the track itself?
Yeah.
Looking down on it?
Yeah, definitely.
Same.
There's tracks on both sides,
Yeah.
aren't there? Yeah.
Yeah, like there's one on the right-hand side,
Yeah.
which is it following the legal, it's still legally Parkvale Road, but it's just a track.
Yeah,
I think the farmer currently, like it's sufficiently well adapted. They can run 4-wheel drives
yeah,
up there and into the farm.
Yeah.
And then further up, I think you might even be able to drive a 4-wheel drive all the way up onto the track.
Yeah, you don't even need a 4-wheel drive to actually get up to a viewing point on, because the Herring Stream 17, and I'm the only one, which is into the 2, we went and had a look.
Do you mean to say that the Herring Stream 17 took a vehicle up there? Sounds a bit slack to me.
You talk to Commissioner Schofield.
well, you'd agree then that, I mean, the visual effects would be quite significant.
Well,
Don't think it's appropriate for
I'm
Mr.
not
Nash to
going
agree
to
with that
make a
question.
call on that.
Yep.
The other thing which came out of Herring Stream 7 was that there actually was no concept plan given to us by the proponents or the submitters, which they now have produced in evidence, having something of a concept plan about how residential development would actually sit in that particular landscape. So we'll talk to more to them some more about that when they come on. I've only got 2 other questions and I'll try and make them fairly quick. One is in relation to your comments about the Horokiwi, the shifting of the coastal environment line. You were disagreeing with Mr. Bray, and your concerns that there will be a precedent for other Western Escarpment properties to be developed. So you're talking about where in particular is viable, which isn't already zone natural open space. Because my looking at the planning maps, there's already a number of constraints.
Yeah,
In that Upper Newlands, Horokiwi area, there's the dress circle which has been developed, and they're the ones which poke out on the other side of the escarpment that you can see from Eastbourne.
Yep.
So, you're concerned about precedent here.
yeah.
Is it actually going to be a precedent when you look at the cold hard reality of development potential on those other sites on the Western Escarpment?
I guess that's for you to make it, for the panel to make a judgment about that.
Well, you were concerned about precedent.
Yeah,
That this is going to, if you're going to shift it here, then there is an argument for other people to shift it elsewhere.
yeah, no, I suspect my view would be over time it would set a precedent. Yeah, because over time there's always this pressure to develop more. But going back to the quarry, I mean, it's very, it's very like your argument about Kilbirnie. So Kilbirnie may once have been in the coastal environment, but you certainly wouldn't say it had any natural coastal character left. And I'd have to agree. And it's the same with the quarry. You'd say, well, for me, it most definitely was in the coastal environment. And the boundary is located as if it were never developed and it was still in the coastal environment. However, the fact is it's been dug up. So it has absolutely, the worked area clearly has absolutely no coastal character left. So like Kilbirnie, you say, ask the question, well, should it be in the coastal environment? And I would say, yes, it should, because the coastal environment's the coastal environment, parts of which obviously have been developed and parts haven't. And the whole coastal policy statement's actually about managing the relationship between the developed and the undeveloped. It's not to say, oh, we're going to make it just areas of high natural character.
Okay. Last one, and we did touch on it before through questions with the chair, is about the outer green belt.
Yeah.
Or the outer town belt, as
Yep.
it's known, it being a special amenity landscape. It's a very large amount of Wellington City, which is in the outer town belt. And I understand your position is that because it's in public ownership, it probably doesn't matter.
Yep.
Okay. But in terms of whether a justification for a special amenity landscape exists, your view is probably not, or it should just take a conservative approach and have it as a special amenity landscape, regardless of any values.
Yeah, no, I'd say it's not. I would say, well, Bothamiscal developed these criteria and they applied it over all landscapes of the city, and they decided on the basis of the process and criteria that Cow and Wrights Hill were special and the rest of the town belt wasn't. And I, having looked at their approach and process and thought about it, I agree with their decision. I think they're right. However, I can also see why the council wanted the whole lot in, because they're seeing amenity as bigger than just amenity. They're saying, oh, it's all public and it's all used for recreation and it's got continuity across the skyline. And so again, it's one of those things where you say, well, in terms of coherence and holism or whatever, you'd say, well, the whole thing should be in because it's all has a similar purpose and it's there for similar reasons. But that doesn't mean that it all looks the same. So it's another one of those silly arguments. So my conclusion is, yes, I accept that only parts of the outer greenbelt qualify as special amenity landscapes. But that's not to say that the rest of the outer greenbelt doesn't have very high amenity values, because it does. But I don't see any reason to say, oh, the whole thing's special, because it's then a matter of coherence across the city, because then people start to say, well, the sort of pro-landscape people will say, oh, well, if the whole of the green belt is special amenity landscape, why isn't this bit of land here special?
Okay, thank you.
Just to follow on from your concern about precedents, and you said earlier that you think that these, a more finer grained sort of approach should be done at a resource consent stage rather than this. So in this situation, we've been provided with a more finer grained assessment of a particular area.
Sorry, you're talking about the quarry.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I was just about to say, I'm talking about, yeah, sorry about that. So in this situation where we've been provided that, is, in your opinion, what we've been provided an adequate assessment for a particular site?
Yes, I think you have, actually, and I agree that this is where we get it. Well, but it does become sort of philosophical. I agree with Shannon Bray. I agree that the site has virtually the bit that's been dug up has no natural character whatsoever. It's a quarry site. So I'd agree that there's no natural character to protect. He then says, well, therefore it's not in the coastal environment. So that's the question: does that mean it's no longer in the coastal environment? And my answer to that is no, it doesn't mean it's not in the coastal environment. It's still in the coastal environment, but what you're saying is, oh, well, we can keep digging even though we're in the coastal environment because there's no natural character to protect.
And so what you're saying is that the two distinct assessments, the coastal environment and natural character,
Yep. Yeah,
but they overlap.
yeah.
So regardless of it being in the coastal environment, regardless of the natural character status, you still believe it's in the coastal environment?
Yeah.
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 And Mr. Bray's assessment, his more finer grained approach,
Yeah.
you agree, but it's still in the coastal environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Following up on that, is the difference in the quarry site not that it's changed the natural character, but it's changed the landform? The starting point for identifying the CE boundary is the first ridge line, and effectively it's shifted where that ridge line is. Because as you say, it's dug out. What was formerly a hill is now a hole.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that the reason? Is that a principal difference that you could make? Not that you focus on the resulting natural character, but that you focus on the resulting landform.
Well, the original boundary put there by Bothamusco followed, and I don't know if this is exactly how they thought, but it followed a line, an imaginary line across the quarry. They said, well, you know, we're working our way along the Western Harbour edge, and this is where the boundary is. And if the quarry weren't there and the hills were still there, this is where the boundary would be. So they kind of, yeah, it's very tricky. So their line imagines the landform as it once was. And I noticed in a supplementary evidence, Shannon Bray accepted that where they put the boundary probably did fairly reflect the topography as it once would have been. Now, the question then is, and I don't have a smart answer, the question then is, well, does the boundary shift because the hill's gone? And I would say, well, no. I would say, no, it doesn't, because it looks funny. You know, it looks, there's a discontinuity in the coastal boundary if you take it to the top of the escarpment, if you remove it where Shannon Bray suggested. But if you were of a mind to shift it, well, I would only remove, well, just coming back to the question I was just asked, you'd only remove the bit where the landform's been modified. So you'd say, all right, well, we'll take that out because the landform's not there anymore, but the rest stays in as part of the coastal environment.
Thank you, Liz.
That was all I had. Thank you.
Question, you have more than one or two, in which case we'll have a coffee.
Just one.
Just
follow
one?
up on what we've just been hearing.
Good answer.
Now, I've just been listening to all the questions that are basically around the same, or all the answers around the same question. You know, where is how much does, or in my view, it is how much does the existence of the actual ridge line contribute to where the line is drawn? And I have just been wondering, it's an overlay, it's a theoretical construct, as we know. Now, that overlay has a purpose. If we say we draw the line where you say the line should be drawn for its continuity, what does that overlay then in that area protect? What's the purpose of the overlay there?
Well, Shannon Bray's argument is it doesn't protect anything because there isn't anything to protect. The values that once existed, the natural character values that once existed have been obliterated by quarrying. So there's no values to protect. So why would you have it in the coastal environment overlay? And it's a fair enough question. And so, but you answered the question at the beginning of your question by, well, it's a question of continuity. You know, so for continuity's sake, you would keep the boundary so that it reflected the original topography.
Even though
Even though the original topography's been altered.
So you, if I understand you right, you're saying you'd rather have that theoretical construct as that continuous line.
Yep.
That's not there anymore. Nobody can see it. It's just a piece of wording in a piece of paper.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really have an effect on anything. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it probably doesn't make much practical difference. So if you say, right, we'll move the boundary so that it excludes all of the area that's been dug up. So that's no longer part of the coastal environment. I think it would look a bit weird, but you could choose to do that. All I'm saying is, well, whether it's in the coastal environment or not, it's a bit like Kilbirnie, you know, activity in the quarry site is not currently constrained by the fact that it's in the coastal environment. It's not, you know, it's not a constraint.
It's neither here nor there.
It's an existing activity. What it would constrain, it'd be one of the constraints on extending the quarry. So I think in an earlier question, I think you were suggesting that, well, if you kept the areas that hadn't been worked in the coastal environment and just excluded the quarry, you would be sustaining the protection of coastal character in parts of the quarry site that hadn't been worked, but you would be saying, well, you know, the worked area is no longer part of the coastal environment.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Thanks very much for that.
I had one question that I'll invite you to think about while we have a cup of coffee. The impression that I had when we were on the site last month, maybe February, seems a long time ago, was that on the Newland side of the site, beyond to the south, I think it's south, maybe it's west, on the city side of the site, there is a big sediment pond on a flat area of the site that clearly hasn't been dug out, and it, in terms of original character, that the quarry have a consent to put overburden on top of. And it seemed to me that the coastal environment line as defined follows the contour along, as you say, it goes on the underside of the houses in Tamworth Crescent, and then curves inland on what appears to be and was always a flat area of, and hasn't been dug out. And that seems inconsistent with your logic about preserving the line as it was. But as I say, think about that, and you can give me an answer in 15 minutes time after we're fortified by some coffee.
Well, be honest now and simply admit that I didn't look at it in the detail that you're describing, actually.
Well, on that note, I wonder if we should invite you to come along with us to the quarry and have a look this afternoon, because I think that that's the area of that's like in terms of what's dividing you and Mr. Bray, that's now the area that's principally in contention. So if you're able to come on a tiki tour of the quarry this afternoon,
Yep.
I think it would probably be beneficial because as I say that seems to be the bit that will matter.
Yep, I can come.
Mr. Searle, transport. Have you organised your own transport? Do I need to volunteer Mr. Dash to take you and Mr. Anstey up the hill?
I've got my private vehicle, which I'm happy to take to the quarry, and I can take Clive with me.
If you don't mind, that would be great. Let's plan on that basis, because the four of us can. What's that? Well, it's over to you, Mr. Searle.
We can sort out the logistics.
We can sort out the logistics.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll break and be back at 11:05. So, Mr. Searle, we talked about logistics. We'll take you up on your offer. If you could transport yourself and Mr. Anstey up to the quarry, and we'll see you there at 2:30, and we'll travel independently.
Perfect.
Now, really, over to you. How would you like to proceed? Well, I suppose I should ask you. Like, I'm assuming that you're going. You two have fought it out as to who's going first. Which set of landscape issues we will deal with first?
I've drawn the short straw, and I'm up first. So should I take it from here?
Please.
So I thought first. So I've prepared the section 42A for the coastal environment, natural character chapter, and the public access chapter. I thought that if we start with the coastal environment chapter, that would flow on nicely, and then I can talk to the other two topics once we finish questions for the coastal environment. I can also, if it would be helpful, provide a brief overview of the coastal environment chapter, kind of how it works with the rest of the plan, or I can move straight into key recommendations.
Why don't you give us the overview, because one of the things with different commissioners sitting on different streams, where there are holes in the knowledge base of the commissioners about, like, obviously I understand generally how the whole plan works, but not at any level of detail where they haven't sat on a particular stream.
Sure. So yeah, I guess in terms of what I've prepared, it's a high level overview, but any questions can help fill those gaps as well. So the coastal environment. So drawing on the section 32 report, the purpose of the coastal environment chapter is to identify the landward extent of the coastal environment and establish appropriate protection for the coastal environment in general, for identified areas of high natural character that are within the coastal environment, and coastal margins and riparian margins within the coastal environment. So we've broadly discussed, I guess, the spatial extent of the coastal environment and how that's been informed by the BOFA report. So I won't, and how that, I guess that the method there has been informed by the NZCPS direction and the ARPS. So I won't touch on that anymore unless you've got specific questions. So with respect to the areas of high coastal natural character, those areas have been identified through the evaluation as outlined in the report, undertaken also by BOFA in 2016, I believe. And that outlines, I guess, how they came to assess the coastal environment as a starting point and get to these identified areas of high and very high natural character. So the plan maps those areas, and in terms of the chapter, the coastal environment chapter treats those very high and high in a similar manner.
My impression looking at the map is that those high coastal character areas, high and very high, are effectively all on the, and they may not be right, all over the sort of headlands, all on the south and west coast.
Sounds correct. Yes. So
So basically, are there any between Moa Point and all the way through to Horokiwi?
No.
Moa Point would be the last one.
Correct. Yeah. 99% sure on that. Yeah.
That's what it looked like.
Yep.
I just refreshed my memory, pulling it up.
So those areas are all mapped in the plan and detailed in Schedule 12. So in terms of Schedule 12, that includes the specific areas and includes the key values of each of those areas, grouped in abiotic, biotic, and experiential values. again, which generally reflect the direction within the NZCPS and the RPS. Just in terms of kind of wider plan context, so the national planning standards require the coastal environment chapter where there is a coastline, and that sets out the approach to managing the coastal environment and giving effect to the NZCPS. So I note that that doesn't require all matters relevant to the coastal environment to be in this one chapter, and that it's anticipated and in some cases required by the national planning standards that giving effect to the NZCPS, those provisions will be located in other parts of the plan. So I think this is, although those provisions aren't, we're not traversing those, and I haven't addressed those directly in my report as they're part of other topics, I think it's just important to note some of these for context in terms of what some of the submitters are seeking and just how the plan works as a whole. So citywide chapters such as subdivision earthworks, those obviously contain those specific rules that apply within the coastal environment, the high coastal natural character areas and the margins. The infrastructure, renewable energy generation, port, airport zone chapters, these seek to give effect to policy 6 of the NZCPS, and in some cases that's where those potentially conflicting kind of higher order direction is reconciled, and that's where that kind of sits in terms of that doesn't occur within the coastal environment chapter per se. Same with the ecosystems and indigenous biodiversity chapter. So that's where those adverse effects on significant natural areas are, and this primarily gives effect to policy 11 of the NZCPS. Same with public access and outstanding natural features, SALs, ridgelines, hilltops, those all obviously overlays that apply over the coastal environment overlay, but do the work in terms of giving effect to policy 15 of the NZCPS. So I guess the key point there, is that it's not intended that the coastal environment chapter apply to or duplicate these matters, particularly where those chapters are intended to be standalone. So that's something that I guess we've seen come through the submissions in terms of a little lack of clarity from some submitters, particularly around the kind of introduction and the guidance in the plan, but also within some of the specific provisions where some submitters are seeking specific kind of recognition of certain things. And
AKA Meridian.
Sorry?
AKA Meridian.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, some really valid points coming up from some of those submissions around that, and we've seen that come through the supplementary evidence or the expert evidence, and I took another look at that through that lens and agreed with some of those, but I can come to that in more detail. So I guess in simple terms, and again raised by one of the experts on behalf of the submitter, the proposed district plan in terms of the coastal environment chapter, it primarily deals with the natural character of the coastal environment. There are some other kind of elements in there in terms of indigenous biodiversity, in terms of the policy, some of the policy direction in there, and there is elements of public access woven through as well, but I would agree that it's primarily focused on natural character. So turning to key matters that have been raised in submissions and kind of the recommendations as the key kind of recommendations as I see them in the section 42A report at a very high level, that the identification of the coastal environment overlay is appropriate and should be retained as notified. That the identification of high coastal natural character areas and associated key values within Schedule 12 is the most appropriate approach to give effect to Policy 13 of the NZCPS and the RPS, and that applying that kind of same policy framework to the entire coastal environment as requested by two submitters, in my view, would be inappropriate. that the proposed district plan's approach to managing natural character within the coastal environment outside of high natural character areas is consistent with the direction of the NZCPS. That the control of Indigenous vegetation removal within the coastal environment, including those high coastal natural character areas, is generally appropriate, and that but that greater control of removal of Indigenous biodiversity or Indigenous vegetation, in the coastal and riparian margins would more appropriately give effect to the NZCPS. And finally, that there is no need for recognition of the operation and functional needs of infrastructure and renewable energy generation in the coastal environment, as these matters are addressed in those subsequent chapters. So that's just a really high level overview. I am happy to and prepared to kind of speak to some more of the detail, I guess, in terms of the specific changes to provisions, if that would be of help, or I'm happy to just take your questions and lead me through the issues that you want to focus on.
I think that what I'd like to do is for you to take our questions and then reflect on whether, basically, whether there are any gaps that you would like to emphasise that we haven't questioned you about. So you have the opportunity to say, well, is there anything? And the other way, the other effect of us taking a site visit is that you'll have the evening to think about it. Whether there are any answers you give us that having thought about it, you want to amplify or even do a U-turn. That's over to you. But I have a question, general question. It really stems from the philosophical discussion we've had with Mr. Anstey about the way this coastal environment chapter is set up, and the discussion he was having with Commissioner Daesh about, well, what natural character values are there in the Kilburnie metropolitan centre, particularly coastal natural character values that require management, because they're not readily apparent to us. And so the question is, so that there is clearly a sliding scale between that is probably at one end of the spectrum, and we've talked about the Horokiwi Quarry, in the middle of that big hole in the ground, there isn't a whole heap of natural character. That's at one end, and then you're down at the coastal margin, where clearly there is a significant coastal influence, significant coastal processes going on. How does the coastal environment chapter reflect that sliding scale? Clearly, you have the very high areas mapped, but across the balance of the coastal environment, how does the chapter manage that sliding scale of coastal influence, coastal qualities, coastal processes, coastal natural character? Does it? And then this Commissioner Daesh's rhetorical question, if there is no coastal character and no coastal processes going on anymore, what's the point of it being in the overlay? Why is it in the overlay if there is no apparent coastal processes or coastal influence happening? So those are big questions, and the answer, there might be the answer might be, well, whatever the merits, there are no submissions to change it, so it is what it is. And we're open to that answer, but we'd like to understand how what the rationale was underlying it from those perspectives. Now that's a whole series of big questions, and so how you choose to answer it, but really whatever assistance you can give us on those big questions.
Sure. I'll do my best not to jump around, but I guess
That's all right. I jumped around, so feel free.
Thank you. I think my starting point at looking at this was to some degree to accept that the coastal environment overlay would be determined by a method that's essentially the outlined by the BOFA report, with any tweaks that might come through, I guess, Mr. Anstey's kind of advice. So for the most part, I've kind of just accepted that the coastal environment will be the coastal environment. So I kind of then turn to, okay, so how do the provisions actually give effect to the NZCPS, and how do they kind of appropriately manage adverse effects on natural character of the coastal environment? So I think it's, I mean, from my perspective at least, the identification of the high coastal natural character areas is an easy concept to kind of get our head around, and that job is done, and there will be submissions on that, and there's advice on specific matters, but those are easy to kind of carve off and understand why you would have a more kind of constraining kind of planning framework to manage adverse effects on those. So that then, I mean, and then you've got the kind of coastal margins and riparian margins that are within the coastal environment that potentially sit outside of, in some cases, outside of those high areas. So they kind of have a bespoke kind of way of managing as well. And I've made some amendments around some slight kind of tinkering on the edges around the provisions around how that works. So then that leaves the kind of rest of the coastal environment. Broadly, I think there is some scope there in terms of the efficiency of the provisions and how the provisions actually address the coastal environment. I'm not sure there's, I'd have to have another look, but I'm not confident at this point that there's submissions around kind of a wholesale kind of reduction, citywide kind of reduction of that overlay, but I'm happy to kind of have a look at those submissions through that lens.
Well, I suppose my assumption is that there's not, and we're starting on that basis, but it's also trying to understand, accepting that is like, I can understand why you would have done what you did. You've expected the technical inputs, and you're trying to plan around that, or plan devise the planning framework around that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of the rest of the coastal environment and the way the objectives and policies kind of are nuanced in terms of that level of protection or achieving the NZCPS or the RPS direction. I mean, my position is that I think that the PDP approach, I mean, I think it works in theory, in that you essentially the underlying, if it's permitted in the underlying zone, then it will be permitted in the coastal environment. It's not into, but where it doesn't meet the standards of the underlying zone, and as recommended through the section 42A, where in the underlying zone it's got a restricted discretionary starting point, adverse effects on natural character of the coastal environment then comes into play as an additional matter of discretion. And that's where it kind of, so that's where I kind of say it works to that extent. But then we get to the point of like, okay, so what values are there in those areas, and how would an overhyped building or something that doesn't meet some of those standards, like what are you actually looking at? So I think that's probably the crux of the issue. And I guess my position at this point is that approach is retained. It doesn't create any more kind of, it's not more onerous in that it doesn't trigger a resource consent in and of itself, and shouldn't, in most cases, be a burden in terms of that assessment. But I guess tend to the conversations that I've heard this morning, that is in a lot of cases, potentially in the examples that were raised, arguably it would be a very, very straightforward assessment to say there aren't any coastal environment values present in this area, so job done. But I guess that approach does leave room for a degree of uncertainty for applicants and processing planners in terms of what are they actually supposed to be looking at here. So
in section 32 terms, one of the costs that wherever a consent is triggered because of the underlying zoning, that for land that's in the coastal environment, you automatically need a landscape assessment of effects on coastal values.
that's not how I see it, and that's not my intent in terms of the changes that I've put through. I would like to think that a planner preparing an application where there are no values present, because they can turn to that BOFA report to look at that assessment. The natural character report, which identifies those high areas. So that does provide some context for applicants for those areas outside of those high. So the values, I guess the lack of values, or the low to moderate values. So that would be the avenue. So I wouldn't expect that a landscape assessment or report would be required for every single resource consent application.
So,
And,
for instance, to give Commissioner Dacia's comment, an over-high building on the bus barn site, does it need an assessment of effect on coastal natural character?
Take your point, and I think that's the crux of the issue here, like the certainty.
Well, on the face of it, it does, but should it? And can the like if we don't have scope to massage the spatial areas, do we have scope to massage the provisions to make that clearer?
I would say so, yes. Both, I guess, in terms of specific provisions, but also from memory, at least one submitter basically saying that the approach is inefficient and will constrain development along those lines. So again, I can kind of maybe highlight some of the specific submitters or submissions around that, but yes, I think that would be within scope.
I think that's one of the things that we'll want to discuss with you in greater detail as we work through the provisions.
So I can just make one more point, I guess.
Yes, sure.
When thinking through this, I did consider whether a slightly more bespoke option was available, where maybe those less modified zones, such as rural or open space zones, were treated differently than highly modified zones. I didn't really reach a point where I felt that was more workable and efficient than the approach that was notified. Like I did start to explore.
Like one of the problems you have is that it's easy to think that the houses on the parade at Lyell Bay over the road from the surf club need to be assessed in terms of their effect on coastal character if they're going too high, but it's not so easy to figure out why the ones six blocks back need to be assessed, and how you would come up with a provision. Like it's easy to say, well, you can't automatically say all residential zones are out, because clearly some of them are right, well, they're within a stone's throw of the coastal margin. Whereas, so that's a bit hard. You might get, well, Mr. Daish's example of the metropolitan zone might be a true exception, which is entirely an island at a distance from the coastal margin. So that might be, but that will only get you, well, that's obviously dealing with one extreme example, but it doesn't, in actual fact, it's probably more the impediment it might create on intensification of Kilbirnie Flats that's an issue, and imposing unnecessary costs. So as you've excluded the idea of having a zone specific provision. I can understand that. So what's the solution?
Well, yeah, I guess I can only stand by my recommendation at the moment, which is that approach, that the notified approach kind of, in my view, gives effect to the NZCPS, more in terms of that kind of maintain natural character, even if that natural character is
Not existing.
accepted to be very low. But there are areas where that natural character is moderate, according to the report. So I guess it is a bit of a broad kind of blanket approach, but you are picking up some of those kind of moderate values in terms of providing a consenting kind of pathway or framework that at least provides the ability to consider effects on those moderate values. And I think that kind of speaks to a couple of the key submitters that were almost kind of looking at least as far as how I interpreted them, almost the flip side of what we're talking about or trying to work through here, and that all of the coastal environment is treated in the same way as the high character areas in terms of the constraints and the provisions, which I disagree with. But yeah, we do have these kind of ends of the spectrum, I guess, in terms of submissions and what we're seeking.
And one more general question. I'll pass over to Commissioner Daish. I picked up your comment at paragraph 52 of your 42A report saying the coastal environment does not include the CMA. And I'm thinking to myself, I thought it went out to the 12-mile limit.
Landward. Thank you.
So the terrestrial.
Correct.
So, or put another way, the area of the coastal environment within Wellington City's jurisdiction.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stops at Mean High Water Springs.
Correct.
Mr. Daish, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, well, I think the chair has indicated a number of the tensions and the issues that I think both yourself and we will be facing in terms of the coastal environment, particularly relating to the mapping itself. And we use the Kilbirnie example, but you could use the central city as also being an example where if you use policy 1 of the NZCPS to define what is the coastal environment, you might be able to say that it is. But we don't have any submissions which were looking at wholesale changes to the mapping of the coastal environment, do we? So it's
not specific to the map.
So apart from Horokiwi, which we'll talk about another time, so we don't have actually the submissions. So it's a matter of the council in terms of your 42A report supporting the mapping of the coastal environment out of the Bofa-Miskell report. Okay, So in terms of our discussions on Kilburnie, and you assume that the mapping is as notified, and you trigger a resource consent for height in relation to boundary, or if it's a number of residential units, it's going to trigger a consent anyway for design and appearance reasons. So a large amount of assessments for a large amount of the built development of the city is going to have an assessment of the coastal environment actually included in it. So it's a matter of proportionality. If you're very close, like Lyell Parade, you're opposite, you know, the surf club there in Lyell Parade, you would probably be able to say that the significance on the coastal environment of a development which exceeded development standards is going to be much greater than it would if it is 6 streets back, but still within the coastal environment. You mentioned you had some thinking about sort of dealing with this difference that there is between, if you like, the really important bits of the coastal environment outside of those which are already high, but as you've already recognised that they're on the south and the western coast. Just be interested in your thinking about how, in terms of policy construct, you might be able to give much more guidance to both applicants and decision makers about how you might deal with that difference. Because if you're looking at Kilburnie and you say Yule Street, for example, which is Te Whiti, one of the cross streets on the flat near the Kilburnie, you're quite some distance from the coast there. And so an applicant, when they're going to be applying for resource consent, sees it's in the coastal environment, is going to need to write a section on impacts on the coastal environment. Would that, and in terms of the way that the plan is drafted at the moment, you would need to go to the objectives and policies that there are. Is there a way in which you could make some sort of differentiation in terms of the policy environment between the Yule Street site and potentially the Lyell Parade site in terms of impacts on the natural character of the coastal environment?
I think in theory you could. And then I would need some more time to.
Yeah, no, I appreciate
that.
I'm at that hypothetical level.
Yep.
Because there has been a obviously a real drive through legislation to make things simpler and quicker and easier and much more apparent to an applicant. So, you know, if you've got a height to boundary recession plane breach in Yule Street, why do you actually need to go to the coastal environment chapter at all? That's the question that I have in relation to the efficacy of the provisions and whether they are proportionate to the level of effect that they are designed to deal with.
Understand that you want to think about that. I think the message from this side of the table is that we're concerned with the efficiency of the coastal environment provisions. We're very aware that altering the map isn't generally a solution available to us, and so we're looking for your assistance. Are there ways we could make it more efficient while still achieving the direction of the NZCPS?
Understood.
Yeah, and just leading from that, because of the way the design guides and multi-unit is actually set up, there will still be a consent process required for at least design and appearance matters on multi-unit development, and whether there could be a way to look at the differentiation that there is between different parts of the mapped coastal environment in terms of the effects on natural character. So I guess that's the challenge. I don't think it's easy to deal with, and I can understand what problems that there are, but if you are an applicant, you're looking at doing some form of development, why do you necessarily need to get at one extreme a full landscape assessment, or you can just say, or just put it in a line, the site is 2 kilometres away from the coast, even though it's in the coastal environment, and whether that will suffice from a decision-making perspective, and whether that's actually efficient. In terms of your 42A, I think we've, and thank you for that. Probably discuss the primary issue that I did have about the differences that there are in terms of the coastal environment. But I did get somewhat confused about policy references that there were, and mainly came out of your rebuttal. And there's one paragraph I really had to read about 3 times to actually work out what was going on. And I'll just point it to you. I can find your rebuttal. Here we are. Sorry, I'm scraping around different pieces of paper here. At your paragraph 18, where you're talking about in your rebuttal about CEP8.
Yes.
Okay. Now there's a number of different references in there, and I think part of the reason for that paragraph is that there were submissions about whether the infrastructure chapter and renewable energy generation should be included, or whether they should be self-contained. I think you've come to a position on that. But in terms of that, could you actually walk through a consent application where P8 is in play? Can we give us a real example where coastal? Are you talking about vegetation removal?
Correct. Yeah.
And again, the whole issue of proportionality between is removing of some coastal vegetation 2 streets away as important as coastal, as if it's right abutting the coast.
Yeah. Do my best. I mean, primarily as notified, putting the policy aside for a sec, the rules essentially are focused on the high character areas, right? I've also recommended that, and you've got some, in my view, reasonably permissive standards around their Indigenous vegetation removal.
Yeah.
So it's not, that you can remove vegetation for a number of reasons with some limitations. So, and through, I should point out that in my rebuttal appendix,
Yeah.
for R5 and R6, the blue text is actually crossed out, whereas it should be underlined. So both R5 and R6 are intended, in terms of my recommendations, to apply to coastal and riparian margins.
The blue shouldn't be.
Blue
Shouldn't be struck out, it should be underlined. So that's an error. So again, permitted and permitted subject to standards.
Yeah.
So that's, I guess that's kind of addressing or part answering the question in terms of the constraints around vegetation removal, but in terms of where are you more concerned with which rules potentially send you back to P8?
Yeah, well, that's an example. about which rules are really going to bite a developer in the developed area. So in terms of the coastal environment.
In a developed area, in a modified,
so
in an urban
just
area.
in
I
an
don't
urban, in a non-rural, non-open space part of the
Arguably
coastal environment.
Well, there'll be certain sites that will be impacted, but I don't think, look, I don't think there is a major impact there.
In terms of the rule framework, so it's permitted, in the underlying zone for the coastal environment all the way over it.
So if we go back to R4.
Yep.
And start there. Vegetation trimming and removal within the coastal environment. So
Yep.
that is intended to apply to indigenous or exotic.
Yes.
So outside the high coastal natural character area.
Yep.
And outside their margins, permitted,
Yes.
right? So that is going to be the rule that is most applicable to your residential type commercial zones within
Yep.
modified areas. So R5, again, exotic vegetation only, but within high and within your margins, based on my recommendations, again, permitted.
And what about for structures?
Structures within
The coastal environment.
Well, before you
Addressed
go,
in a different
before you go to structures, could you just go the rest of the way? So
then indigenous vegetation trimming or removal within the coastal environment that's in a high coastal area or within your margin, permitted subject to those standards.
Yes.
So arguably, I'd have to do a very kind of granular exercise, but I would be reasonably confident to say that outside of the high coastal natural character area, so just looking at those margins, these standards are going to be quite permissive. Like there aren't going to be a lot of coastal riparian margins that don't already fall into one of those high, but it does kind of go a bit further in terms of that indigenous biodiversity protection directed by the NZCPS. So that's the justification for that little add-on. But I don't think you could look at this and think and consider that it's constraining in terms of, or that it's any constraint on development.
Okay.
I may have missed something.
before you go on, like one specific issue, it's subject to standards, and S1 is the relevant one. Policy context. You initially put reference into infrastructure.
Yes.
And then took it out again,
Yeah.
having thought about the implications of Ms. Foster's evidence and your response to it, which was effectively not required because it's all dealt with in the infrastructure and REG chapter.
Correct.
The question then, and so you took out reference to public roads. Why does S1 still refer to formed public roads necessary to ensure the safe and efficient operation of formed public road? Or is that just something that that was the third level consequential impact that you might not have thought about?
I suspect so, yes, the latter, that it's potentially a consequential change to, and then I guess I would need to.
Well, like just leave it there.
Yeah.
Can I just draw your attention to that?
Yes.
Something for you to think about, whether there need to be some more consequential deletions in S1 to line it up with where you've landed on the policies and the rules, because they appeared inconsistent to me.
Yep. Thank you.
So, sorry, Commissioner Dash.
That's all right.
About buildings now.
Yeah, just in terms of buildings. Now you've got S2, standard 2, which talks about new buildings and structures within the coastal environment, and then you've point one
within high coastal natural character areas.
Yeah, but it says new buildings and structures within the coastal environment and within high coastal natural character areas. that's the
My
the
intent or-
description of the standard.
Yeah, what does the and mean?
Yeah, so in you would have seen this in terms of maybe some of my kind of restructuring of some of the other provisions where I've kind of tried to bullet point and make it a bit clearer. Maybe that's required here, but my understanding is definitely that this applies to buildings and structures in high coastal natural character areas. It's not supposed to.
Wonder
apply
if the heading
broader
should say within the high natural coastal area of the coastal environment.
something to that effect.
Yeah, because the way I looked at that standard was it's within the coastal environment. So one is excluded because it's within the high coastal natural character area. But two, you need to have exterior facade and roof must be finished in a colour that is contained within those there. So if it's in the coastal environment, your 4 streets back in Kilburnie, to comply with that standard, you're going to have to build to do it in those colours.
That is not how I understand the standard. It's intended the standard apply. I can go back to the 30.
Yeah, so it could be. Yeah, it could be that you just remove the words within the coastal environment, or as the chair says, within the high coastal natural character area of the coastal environment for that standard as being an option. So just going back to structures and the use of the whole coastal environment overlay, and where it hits at a rule-based level for those areas which aren't in the high natural coastal areas. So in terms of rules, if you comply with the underlying zone, you get a big tick.
Yep.
But if you don't comply because you've got a recession prone breach, or you over height by a story, or you can't comply with the transport provisions, whatever they might be that are applicable to the site, where is the rule that deals with those, which takes you back to having to have a look at the policies?
Bear with me. But in part 15. Yeah.
So if you permit it under 15, it's all good. You're all pickety boo under the zone provisions. Then you go to RDA, all those others there for those zones, those, if you like, the developed area zones. Then all other zones is discretionary.
Just look at 15. Is that the same wording? Look at the heading.
Yeah, yeah.
Within the coastal environment
That's on
and
my
within
mind
coastal.
immediately as well. If you just give me 30 seconds. No, sorry. So if you look at 12, R12, so that's the construction, addition, or alteration of buildings and structures within the coastal environment, outside high, outside your margins.
Okay.
Permitted, where it's, and you see some changes from myself there. Permitted where it complies, RD where it does not, essentially.
Yep.
With your matters of discretion listed in 12.2. Well, yeah.
Okay, so
Sorry, and just to clarify, 15 was specific to coastal or riparian.
okay, so just going back to R12, if you're in the RDA category because you're over height,
Yes.
you therefore need to do an assessment under CE, PA, P1, P2, and P3 of PA.
I think it's just CEP2 and
Well, potentially public access as well.
and public access.
Yeah, but concentrating on P2.
Yes.
Okay, and so to deal with that situation where you're 4 streets back and you're wanting to put an additional story on a proposal, CEP2 is your driver for whether or not it's going to get the tick or not.
Correct.
So looking at CEP2, it says, your addition there about avoiding any significant adverse effects on natural character of the coastal environment. You think that scenario will get the tick there under number 3 because it's so far away from the coastal environment, or it's part of the residential neighbourhood in Kilburnie?
That would be my
Which
expectation.
leads,
Without that addition, and it's even less directive, I guess, in terms of what should be considered. But that would be my intention. But I take your point on.
yeah. Well, so it goes back to our original discussion about whether or not the actual coastal environment overlay is too big or not, and it's going to strike people needing to do some, a coastal assessment of some kind to prove that there's no adverse effects, or whether that's necessary at all.
I mean, arguably, there will be areas where it isn't necessary, but there will be areas where it is also necessary. Yeah. So it's trying to find that balance, and like you say, whether there's a more nuanced or kind of bespoke option there to try and put through that issue.
But hypothetically, though, and thinking about the Kilburnie area in general, wouldn't vast amounts of the coastal overlay, you're going to say, well, it's so far away that it doesn't really matter, which leads you to the question about whether or not the coastal environment should be mapped like it is. And
I mean, it's definitely one way of looking at it. The way I've looked at it is slightly different in that, on the assumption that the coastal environment overlay has been mapped according to higher level direction. It is what it is, and then you need a planning framework that actually is effective and efficient.
That's right. So, I'm just wondering whether there is some sort of middle ground in between the two to actually take into account those areas where you really want to consider coastal natural character, and those areas which are much more removed from the physical coastline, but because of natural historical processes are within the coastal environment according to the Buffer's mapping.
You're talking about proximity to the coastline. You're essentially doing another exercise to identify a sub.
Well, you would probably say anything within X meters of mean high water springs. Probably what you.
That would be nice and clean if defendable, but I don't know whether a whole bunch of landscape architects could easily agree on that, and whether it would be applicable in this part of the coast compared to this part. So I mean that's an exercise that could be undertaken. Arguably, and I'm reluctant to even throw this out there, but arguably you could look at the entire plan and look at all those triggers that would apply. So any RD rule across all zones, and actually start to think about a more bespoke approach of, okay, well, which one of these, which group of these rules is actually going to potentially or create an effect on natural character, and just poke it into the right spots. But
yeah, I accept what you say to that degree. It's just the sheer extent of the coastal environment triggering an assessment under P2 for a rule breach, and whether that is appropriate in terms of efficiency. I can probably leave that with you
Yeah.
if you like.
I have a question about while you're on P2. Does the fact that they're all conjunctive and create an issue for non-residential development? That whether it's ever going to consolidate existing urban areas, like we have the obvious example before us of the quarry. Will the quarry, an extension of the quarry, ever consolidate existing urban areas? Should that be an or?
After one.
After one. Like three should apply to both arms. But the question is, should 1 and 2 be alternatives? They're actually, to my mind, two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
And so the question is whether you need both of them. If you're not establishing new urban sprawl, are you necessarily consolidating existing urban areas? But that's a different point. My question is about, like, we can put REG to one side, we can put infrastructure to one side because that's dealt with separately, but it's non-residential development of any kind that's not necessarily going to be linked, like a farmhouse, a farm barn.
I entirely agree. I think that an or would be more appropriate there. And then 3 should apply in all cases.
So probably way to do it would be start with 3 and then put 2 as sub-alternatives.
Yep.
Because otherwise you get in horrible questions about whether the and applies to both alternatives or just one. And algebraically you'd put brackets around them. But okay. Sorry, Commissioner Dash. Just while it was going past my eye.
No, I've just sort of been jumping around a little bit anyway. P10, your paragraph 42 of your rebuttal.
Yep.
You recommend amendments to P10?
Yeah, sorry.
I don't see any amendments to P10 in the Appendix A.
Yeah, so they haven't, an error they haven't been taken through. But P10 is and sorry if I'd kind of gone through the specific changes to the specific provisions as part of my intro, I would have picked up some of these things and highlighted them to you, but
So
we're here.
So what's P10 supposed to say? Oh, sorry, P10.
P10, yep, P10. So the idea for P10 as per my supplementary is that it would read so it would read, avoid the establishment of new quarrying and mining activities and new plantation forestry. So activities that are incompatible with or detrimental to the natural character and qualities would be struck out.
Yeah.
And it would be focused on those activities that is notified and in terms of the rule framework have been identified as inappropriate activities.
Was that an R11? Did I remember? You said that was the reason for that policy.
Correct.
Mining.
Activities that are incompatible with or detrimental to the natural character and qualities would did this on the fly. So that's kind of what I'm thinking would be struck out, and it would be specific to new quarrying and mining activities and new plantation forestry.
Is that too narrow in terms of only plantation forestry and new mining activities?
Yeah, I mean,
could it be contemplated there,
which is open.
Yeah.
With a rule that is quite specific.
Whereas I understand it, the justification for the policy is to support the rule. That's what you've told us.
Well, yeah, I mean, the rule
Like,
achieves policy.
well, we're not suggesting that you've backfilled it, but or I'm not, but in terms of in the integration between policy and rule, the rationale for the policy rule is related to that rule.
Yes.
And
Yeah, and I think one of the submitters, I think Ms. O'Sullivan, signalled that in her evidence chief that my recommended amendments to P2 in terms of avoids adverse effects, that limb that we were just talking to, if I recall her evidence correctly, provides enough policy support for an avoidance rule, a non-complying rule. But my preference, I guess, was for it to be a bit more explicit.
question then might be, in the context of a non-complying activity, why don't you just, like you have avoid these activities? Why aren't they just prohibited? Or alternatively, why don't you have a policy that that says avoid these activities unless they have no more than minor adverse effects? Pick up the one gateway, because it clearly is not going to pass the other gateway.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I prohibited activity status makes me nervous, so my preference would be the latter if you were getting down that path to be a bit more specific.
Thinking about the logic of what you're suggesting, that if it's as blunt as avoid these activities, isn't that a prohibited activity? And if the answer is, well, you're keeping the option open for a no more than minor, then why not say that? Like I think certainly what Ms. O'Sullivan was picking up on was the words detrimental to. What does that mean? Is that coded language for avoid any effects on natural character and qualities? So maybe we'll call a spade a spade. So avoid activities that unless they have no more than minor effects on those issues. That's just floating an idea. Since I hadn't picked up that you deleted the balance.
Yeah, easy on that one.
These things happen, especially when you're running a rebuttal deadline. We all know about that feeling. So sorry, Mr. Dash, I floated that idea.
No,
I don't know what you think about that idea in any way. So no doubt you'll tell us in due course.
It's probably enough for me for now. I may have one or two more, but I just need to collect my thoughts on those. It's okay.
Okay. Mr. Birch, would you like to have a go?
Well, mine are probably a little bit more following your 42. If you no, back just conscious. So it's to do with the introduction and your recommendation to include the natural open space zone, Lyell Bay to Mile Point, Lyell Bay and Mile Point. Sorry, Guardians of the Bay suggests that this is perhaps confusing. they think it maybe captures Moa Point Beach. And so I just wondered how you got to that, and whether Guardians of the Bay, you know, whether maybe they're confused or I'm confused clearly. So I just wondered whether that description is obvious and it is describing the piece of land that you're endeavouring to describe.
Yeah, I think their suggestion, or Ms. Weber's suggestion on their behalf, was talk about the intersection of
Stuart Duff,
Stuart
to
Duff,
Point.
Duff and Moa Point Road,
Yeah.
rather than Moa Point,
Mm.
which is all the way on the
All the
other
way
side of the
around.
beach.
Yeah. So I just wondered, yeah, whether that description is correct in terms of what you're seeking to be inserted.
Guess I've had the benefit of considering this issue across a few hearing streams.
Yeah.
And I've probably pulled that through in a consistent manner, but I can look at it in a bit more detail just to make sure that it will be interpreted as intended and that it's drafted as intended.
Yeah.
Well, what did you have in mind? What bit of dirt
Well,
would be would be in, and what bit would be out, to your mind?
The way that it's supposed to work or intended to work, and I won't speak on behalf of the airport, but I guess, you know, that's the key submitter that sought this is the area of natural open space zone that where these seawalls are located. So I guess there is always the option of actually specifying specific parcels or getting into a bit more detail to be really clear.
I think it's a part parcel, because the beach is an SNA.
Mm.
So it's to your mind, so what you're thinking of is it's at the end, it's at the eastern end of the beach, western end of the beach.
Correct.
And the only issue is, how do you describe that accurately?
Yeah. I'd be more than happy to hear from the submitter if they have they've watched this.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is that the submitter might have a point, and the only issue is how you capture what is intended.
Correct.
Yeah. Yep.
And so I think we'll leave that one with you.
Yeah, fine. And if I guess I'd just flag that if there is a recommended change, then we might need to look at some consequential changes to other chapters, or pick that up somehow.
Because it's a part of a zone that you're describing.
Yes.
Mr. Burke?
A general, I mean, we'd sort of touched upon it before about the headings to some of these.
Mm.
And that was one of my questions, so I'll just bring it up again. It's just sort of hard to read where you say, we say, within the coastal environment and within high coastal, it's just sort of, is it both? Is it one? And some of them have got a comma. Some of your headings have got a comma after in the coastal environment, comma within. So I just wondered, are they to be read differently to the ones that haven't got a comma? Clearly I think you're meaning the same thing on all these headings, but it's just not coming across.
When you say, are you talking to my recommended amendments or as notified, or both?
I've got your rebuttal in front of me, so I'm there. That's sort of a start at the end, if you like.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's come all the way through, so nothing's changed.
I'm happy to have a look at all of the headers and just make sure that
those ones that it's just hard. I mean, I was struggling and I had it as a question. Other people have sort of brought it up too, so I just wondered if it could be a little bit clearer.
Yep.
Whether you turn it on its head a little bit or something.
So I wonder if the request is that you review all of those rules where it says and say, is and literally what you mean? Or do these headings need to be, but we will then need to think about whether there is scope for a clarification. But let's do it one step at a time. So I was looking at one you mentioned to us. There was an error in the transcription, so it's fine that you corrected an error. R5. So exotic vegetation traveling within the coastal environment, within coastal high character, natural character, and coastal and riparian margins. The coastal and riparian margins might or might not be within the high natural character areas.
Correct. Look, I think I'll look at it, but
Yeah.
an easy solution, or part of an easy solution, is to maybe get rid of the reference to coastal environment and just reference all of these areas are going to be within the coastal environment.
Yeah, because this is the chapter. So yeah, perhaps that's the easy solution, is getting rid of that.
Yeah, or the trouble is there are riparian margins outside the coastal environment.
But the chapter doesn't apply.
Well,
Yeah.
is there anywhere that says that?
I believe it says it in the introduction, and I hope that I've clarified that through.
Well, yeah, but in terms of, this is the picky lawyer point.
Yeah. But I mean,
that you have a stray rule that applies on its face outside the.
Yeah, look, I can easily work through that and get some recommendations too.
Okay.
Without wishing to hustle you, Mister.
You go ahead.
No, if you're going to, if your question is going to take more than 5 minutes, I'll draw stumps, and we'll come back in the morning, because I have a number of questions for Mr. Searle, and we haven't got to Commissioner Lutz.
Yeah. Sorry, I've lost my train now.
I think the answer to that question might be that we're going to adjourn on that basis for our site visit. We won't come back at 1:30 and try and have half an hour. We'll meet you at the quarry, and Mr. Anstey at the quarry at 2:30, and we'll be back here with a few more questions for you at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you. So the hearing is adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow. The panel will be busy in the meantime, looking at aspects of the coastal and landscape, and some of the landscapes that are not on the coastal environment.